I'm continuing on from yesterday, trying to fix up this chassis to get the chassis rails the right distance apart. So I've taken out the front cross member. That's this here. You can see how this has all been fabricated. It's all really nicely made and it's nice and solid. It's just half an inch too short for some reason. So I've taken that out. It turns out the nuts and bolts, the nuts weren't captive, so I can replace those with some BSF ones, which would be good. So what I'm doing is making spaces to go on the ends of these, and I wanted to make those out of 1/4 inch, or rather 6mm steel plate. I have this steel plate, but it turns out that's only 5mm. So I went through my junk box and found some angle iron, and at the moment I'm just going through and using the angle grinder, roughing these out, and then I'll clean those up, and they'll basically make little spacer plates to go either end of this tube. It's interesting with that cross member out, the chassis is sitting at the exact right width at the moment. I'm guessing because the springs in the axle are holding it at the right width apart, although none of the U-bolts are actually done up tight at the moment, so everything is still a little bit wobbly. I will have to make sure that the rails are parallel, so I may need to, what I'm thinking I'm going to have to do is bolt the front one in, so this is the correct width across the front, and then I may need to push these apart slightly. And what I think I'll have to do is probably I'll run string lines from the front of the car all the way down to the back to give me 2 parallel lines, and probably using, I think I'll use the bottle jack out of my press there and suitable spacers, and I should be able to just force these apart. We're only talking 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, not much at all. So that should be enough to get those into the right position. It's very, very close at the moment, because you can drop the engine on and the bolts go through the holes for the engine mounts. So I'll get the front done first and then measure everything up again and see how it comes out. So one thing you have to note is, if these chassis rails aren't parallel, you're going to throw off the steering column angle, and it's a bit hard to tell at the moment because everything's just sitting there loosely, which is why I need the string lines. But by eye, it's looking pretty straight at the moment. It's reasonably in line. So I think I'll finish off the front cross member. I'll put some paint on the little panels, because this tube, once it's in place, I think it can stay bolted in place, and the chassis gets painted around it, or it gets painted on the chassis. So I'll probably spray some primer on it, and I may also squirt some rust proofing down the inside of that tube. I don't think that would ever rust through, but it's not going to hurt. And I need to finish cutting these out. The reason they're not fully cut out is because they're slightly wider than this width across here, which means I'm going to have to slice down here and then file it all flat to get my flat plates. Oh, the other thing I found out when I was talking to people in the UK about getting the measurements is the U-bolts. So I've seen pictures of Brooklands, original Brooklands and replicas, where instead of the U-bolts, they actually have just flat plates and bolts going through. Apparently that's what you do if you don't have a good set of U-bolts. The original U-bolts, the proper Riley ones, are cast, similar to how they are on the Austin 7, and they're actually a flat section under here, cast steel, so they clamp really well. I think what I've got here will work okay, and it looks a little bit neater than just thick plates with bolts straight through them. I finished making my little steel spacers there. I finished sort of cutting them out using the angle grinder, and then just used the little bench grinder and ran the random orbit sander over them just to key them up a little bit. I'm going to spray them with some etch prime and then bolt them in place. Doing stuff like this isn't difficult, but it takes a lot of time. It's just a lot of fiddling around. So I think that's probably taken me an hour or so to do, which is, it's one of the interesting things building cars like this. I mean, there's a certain amount of cost in parts and getting things machined and stuff like that. But if you were paying somebody to build this for you, that's where most of the cost would be. It would just be so expensive in the labor, which is good that I can do all this myself, even though I'm sort of learning as I go. Another interesting thing I've noticed watching a lot of YouTube videos, especially American ones, they seem to refer to the angle grinders as death wheels, but then ironically always seem to be running them without the guards on them. So that always seems a little bit odd to me. Okay, I have the front cross member bolted back in with my spacers either end, and that's actually set it to exactly the right measurement across the front, which was 22 3/8 inches. So that's good. And I've been trying to figure out the best way to do a string line from the front of the car down to the rear of the car. And I did try just with some sort of clamps and things, trying to get a point down at the rear of the car there that I could measure to. And then I came up with an idea. What I ended up doing is I took my magnetic base clamp thing, and I took the clamp part off it. It just unscrews, and I was actually going to use a piece of threaded rod. This is just 8mm threaded rod as a vertical post, but it turns out this is too flexible. It just wobbles around too much. So I ended up using a piece of I think it's 1/2 inch brass bar. I turned down the end and put an 8mm thread on it to go into the magnetic base, and I measured basically but because that magnetic base is all designed for machining and accurate measuring, I can get an accurate measurement from the back of it to the center line of that brass bar. And I was able to measure the center line of the car. You can see the little spot there. And by pushing the magnetic base hard up against the ends of the chassis rails there, I could get a very accurate measurement from the center line to this piece of string. When I say very accurate, and accurate enough for me. So all I had to do is make that same measurement on the front, and I did that by taking out the grease nipple and just using a BSF bolt. And I know what the measurement across the back is, and I was able to figure out what the measurement across the front here is, and I was able to put the string line across the threads of the bolt in the exact right place. The bearing shell there is just some weight to keep the string taut. And by doing that, I have now been able to measure from the chassis rail to the string at either point. And it turns out that this side is pretty much bang on. There may be about a 1/16 of an inch difference, which I'm struggling to measure any more accurately than that, to be honest. So I'm probably going to have to call that close enough. And what I'll do is do the same measurement on the other side and just check that rail is also parallel. But you can see just by eye, it looks pretty close. It's pretty good. It's not like it's miles off. The steering column seems to be parallel to the piece of string. I can't really measure that one easily because they're at different angles. So what I'll do is I'll swap this around to the other side of the car and just check that side is also parallel. But what I found when I actually measured it is once I had this bar bolted back in, the back started behaving, and the difference in the measurements from the front here to where the engine mounts are is very small now. I think it's less than 1/8 of an inch. So I think that's actually pretty close. I'll see what happens when I drop the block back on to make sure that the engine mounts will still just line up. But I think we're looking pretty good. Oh, the other thing I had to do when I fitted this bar at the back is I've been very careful to make sure that that's actually exactly perpendicular to the rear chassis rail. So I used a big square, and because I hand cut, well, with a die, but hand formed with the die, the thread on the end there, the thread isn't perfectly parallel to the bar, so I was able to rotate the bar, which was slightly off center, and by rotating it around I could get it so that it was vertical in the plane that I needed, and then just tightened up the lock nut. So that's all looking pretty good. I'll measure the other side and see how that looks. I've done the same on the other side of the car now, all carefully measured, set up. When I moved the clamp at the end, I made sure it was still perpendicular to the chassis rail. I should also mention that the bottom of that stand actually has a machined sort of V groove in it, so it fits accurately onto the circular cross member. But this side looks even closer than the other side, so this one is pretty much as close as I can measure, just with a normal ruler. I'm sort of starting to get down to the thickness of the string, so I'm going to say that's actually pretty much bang on. It's interesting just bolting this cross member in tight, making sure the bolts were really done up with those 1/4 inch spaces either end, has brought it all back into alignment. So that does seem to be what the problem actually was originally. So I'll move my string. I've checked the suspension all seems to move quite freely. I'm going to put the block back in place, and hopefully I can call that done. So this is all finally back together, all bolted on, and it's looking pretty good. So I measured everything up, and definitely putting in the front cross member has brought everything back to where it should be. The springs seem parallel to within, it's getting down to what I can measure accurately, but 1/16 of an inch or so. So very, very close. The block, when I put that back in place, the bolts just drop straight through the holes. So I think that's all lined up. Steering column looks straight, parallel to the car and the torque tube. I'm not actually sure the torque tube's centralized. That's just sort of sitting there at the moment, so that might not be perfectly down the middle. So that's all looking really good now. I did actually finally get to repair my front cover as well. So I welded up where the lug had cracked off, or almost cracked all the way through. So I just sort of built it up with weld and then filed it back. So those and the block are ready to go off to the chap who's going to remetal them for me. And I should also ask him if he can remachine the flywheel to fit the new taper on the new crankshaft. But that'll be a job for next week. I'm not sure what I need to do next on this. I still need to figure out the rear spring mounts and sort out what's going on there. And I've pretty much decided I will use the aluminium axle, because that's going to be a lot lighter, 7 kg lighter. So I may look at start looking at cleaning that up and figuring out how that all goes back together. One final quick thing to mention is sitting on this wooden dolly. The chassis has always been about an inch and a half higher than it will actually be when it's on the road. And at the moment I have it sitting so that the front axle is actually on block, so some of the weight is actually sitting on the springs at the moment. And if you measure up to the spindles from the ground, that's sitting at about 14 inches. and I believe the diameter of the tires I'm getting is 26 inches. So that all seems to work out. That'll if the body all drops an inch, these will drop an inch as well, which gives me the 13-inch radius for the 26-inch diameter tires. So that's all actually looking like it's where it's supposed to be.